Here's the default assumption most people carry around: trauma is a single big event. A car crash. A death. Combat. Something dramatic enough to leave a visible scar. Under that assumption, if your childhood didn't include an obvious catastrophe, you're in the clear. Whatever you're dealing with as an adult must be a personality quirk, a character flaw, just how you are. That assumption is exactly what the research spent the next 3 decades dismantling. Start with Fawning. In the 1990s, psychotherapist Pete Walker began treating adult survivors of chronic childhood neglect and emotional abuse, and he noticed a trauma response that wasn't in the textbooks. The existing model only had 3: fight, flight, freeze. Walker identified a 4th, which he named Fawning, the reflex to instantly appease, agree, and please a threat in order to disarm it. A child raised by an unpredictable or volatile caregiver learns, often before age 5, that conflict is dangerous and compliance is survival, so the nervous system wires itself to scan every room for tension and neutralize it before it escalates. Here's the mechanism: this isn't a personality trait, it's a threat response loop running on autopilot, the same circuitry a prey animal uses to go still and submissive in front of a predator, except in a human it looks like over-apologizing, saying yes to things you don't want, and feeling a genuine wave of anxiety at the idea of someone being mildly annoyed with you. Here's the thing nobody tells you about the easygoing people pleaser, at work or in your friend group: that's very often not a personality. That's a 5-year-old's survival strategy still running the show. Then there's hypervigilance, and this one has a physiological signature you can actually measure. Neuroscientist Stephen Porges developed what's called Polyvagal Theory in 1994, mapping how the vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in the body, regulates your body's shift between safety and threat. In a child growing up in an unpredictable household, that system gets trained to stay on alert almost constantly, scanning tone of voice, facial micro-expressions, the sound of a door closing a little too hard, because in that environment, missing a warning sign had real consequences. The adult version of this shows up as someone who can read a room instantly, who feels a spike of dread at an unread text from a certain person, who startles more than others at raised voices that aren't even directed at them. Sound familiar? Because this is the same mechanism as the fawn response, just aimed outward instead of inward. One scans for danger, the other neutralizes it once it's found. Here's where it gets genuinely counterintuitive, though. You'd expect that a child who grew up unable to rely on their caregivers would grow into an adult desperate for connection. Sometimes that's exactly what happens. But an enormous number go the opposite direction entirely, into what trauma researchers call hyperindependence. Psychiatrist and researcher Bessel van der Kolk, who spent over 4 decades studying trauma survivors and published his findings in his 2014 book The Body Keeps the Score, documented a pattern among children who were repeatedly let down by the adults meant to protect them. They learn, with total clarity, that needing someone is the setup for disappointment, so they stop needing. Their mechanism is a kind of preemptive strike against future abandonment: if you never lean on anyone, no one can ever fail to catch you. In adulthood, that becomes the person who refuses help even when it's freely offered, who feels a genuine wave of discomfort receiving a gift, who would rather struggle silently through a move, a breakup, a hospital stay, than ask a single person for support. It looks like strength from the outside. It functions like a wound on the inside. Now take perfectionism, because this is where the pattern gets almost architectural in its logic. Psychologists Gordon Flett and Paul Hewitt spent over 2 decades researching what they called socially prescribed perfectionism, the specific flavor of perfectionism rooted not in personal ambition but in a felt sense that love and safety were conditional on performance. A child praised only for achievement, or punished disproportionately for small mistakes, learns an equation early: mistakes equal danger, flawlessness equals safety. Here's the mechanism, and it's almost mathematically clean. If the world felt unpredictable and unsafe, and you couldn't control the adults around you, controlling your own output became the one lever you actually had. The adult result is someone who can't submit a project without checking it for extra times, who feels actual physical distress at a visible typo, who ties their entire sense of worth to a performance review. That's not high standards. That's a control strategy wearing a suit. Then there's repetition, and this is arguably the strangest pattern of all. first named by Sigmund Freud over a century ago as the repetition compulsion, and it has held up remarkably well under modern trauma research. The theory is simple to state and uncomfortable to sit with. People raised in chaotic, unpredictable, or emotionally unsafe environments often find themselves, as adults, unconsciously drawn to relationships and situations that recreate that exact same instability. Not because they enjoy the pain. Because familiarity, even painful familiarity, registers to the nervous system as more predictable, and therefore safer, than the genuine unknown of a calm, stable relationship, which can paradoxically feel foreign and even suspicious. Van der Kolk's later work reinforced this with attachment research showing that adults raised by inconsistent caregivers often describe emotionally stable partners as boring and chaotic ones as feeling like chemistry. Here's the thing nobody tells you about that feeling of instant, electric connection with someone unpredictable. Your nervous system might just be recognizing a familiar climate, not a soulmate. The last pattern is the quietest one, and possibly the most corrosive: chronic self-blame. Psychiatrist Judith Herman, in her landmark 1992 book Trauma and Recovery, documented something that seems backwards until you understand the logic behind it. Children who are mistreated by a caregiver overwhelmingly blame themselves rather than the caregiver, even into adulthood, even when they can intellectually recognize the abuse for what it was. Their mechanism is protective, not masochistic. A child depends entirely on their caregiver for survival, so believing "I am bad" is actually less terrifying than believing the person I depend on for everything is unsafe and unreliable, because the first belief at least leaves you a theoretical path to fix it by being good enough. That single belief, formed for survival at age 4 or 6 or 8, often calcifies into a permanent internal narrator that shows up decades later as an adult who apologizes reflexively, assumes fault in every conflict, and struggles to accept that a relationship's problems weren't somehow their responsibility to prevent. So look at everything sitting on the table now. You've got Fawning, a nervous system trained to disarm conflict before it starts. You've got Hypervigilance, a body that never fully powers down its threat detection. You've got Hyperindependence, a mind that decided needing people was too dangerous to risk again. You've got Perfectionism, a control strategy dressed up as ambition. You've got repetition compulsion, a pull toward the familiar disguised as chemistry. You've got chronic self-blame, a survival belief that never got the memo that the danger is over. Here's the single thread running under every one of those 6 patterns. Every single one of them made perfect sense at the time they were built. None of them are malfunctions. They are solutions, engineered by a developing brain under conditions it wasn't equipped to fully process, and installed with one job: get you to adulthood alive and intact. The tragedy isn't that these systems exist. The tragedy is that most of them were never designed with an off switch, because the child who built them had no way of knowing the danger would eventually end. Which brings this back to that dropout list in a San Diego weight loss clinic in 1985, patients who'd done the hard part, who'd lost the weight, who'd achieved the exact outcome they said they wanted, and then quietly walked away because some older, more urgent part of them had decided that outcome wasn't actually safe. That's not weakness. That's architecture, built decades earlier by someone far younger than you are now, someone who didn't have any other tools available. You are very likely still living inside a structure that someone under the age of 10 built for you out of whatever material fear handed them. The walls might not fit anymore. But you get to be the one who finally looks at the blueprint, and decides what stays, and what finally gets torn down.